Hi, in this video we are going to talk about policy instruments. Those are the tools that we use to compel behavior change, to get people or industries, factories, governments to do the things that we want them to do. And we're going to talk about 6 different policy instruments. Some of them we've talked about already in some of the policies we've discussed, and others we'll talk about now related to the Clean Air Act, or they'll be coming up soon in the Clean Water Act or the National Environmental Policy Act. But the 6 policy instruments that we're going to talk about are bans, permits, technology and performance standards, information-based policies, and economic-based policies. And we'll give a couple of examples of each and talk about some of their strengths and weaknesses. So the first policy instrument that we're going to talk about is a ban. That's a prohibition on a behavior or on the use of a product. One example of a ban is in the Endangered Species Act, in the ESA, where we have a prohibition on take. Remember, that's the ban on take. Take means to wound, harm, kill, collect, hunt, trap any species on the endangered species list. And the Endangered Species Act has a prohibition on take. That's Section 10 of the Endangered Species Act, and it comes with stiff penalties if you're found to do any of those things. Another example of a ban that we have talked about is in the Clean Air Act and the Montreal Protocol. And that's a ban on ozone-depleting chemicals, those chlorofluorocarbons that deplete the stratospheric ozone layer that prevents UV rays from the sun from reaching the Earth's surface. And in the early 90s, the United Nations and nations around the globe promulgated the Montreal Protocol, an international treaty, an agreement between countries, to ban the production and the use of these ozone-depleting chemicals. The next policy instrument that we will talk about are permits. Permits are restrictions or limits or regulations on behavior, but they still allow you to participate in that behavior. They just kind of give you permission to do it. So without the permit, you're not permitted to participate in a certain behavior, and with the permit, you are. It doesn't always relate to a particular behavior. It might relate to the use of a certain product. But essentially, a good example of a permit is something like your driver's license. You're not allowed to drive a car unless you have met the certain training requirements, passed the test, gone through the class, those kinds of things. Another example of a permit is the license that you get in order to be a pesticide applicator, or your license or certification for asbestos removal and asbestos monitoring or water quality monitoring. Other permits might relate to health and safety requirements, like you can take the class to get your HAZWOPER certification to handle hazardous materials. And some permits come with performance and technology requirements. Performance requirements are things like the vehicle emissions standards that your car is required to meet in New York State. If your car isn't meeting those vehicle emission standards, it's emitting stuff from the tailpipe that goes above the allowed threshold in New York State, then your car doesn't get the certification or the permit it needs to be driven. Your vehicle safety requirements are technology requirements. You have to have working seatbelts, working headlights and blinkers and those kinds of things. If you don't have those technology requirements, then your car doesn't get certified and permitted to drive on the road. So that's a ban and a permit, and we'll move on and look at a couple other policy instruments. So next we have a technology standard. A technology standard is a type of regulation where the government mandates that you use a certain kind of technology that the government believes will achieve its goals for reducing pollution or keeping people safe. A good example of a technology standard is in the Clean Air Act, where the government says that new pollution sources, these are new industrial facilities being constructed now, that these new sources of pollution have to use what the government calls best available emissions technologies. So these are devices, they might be scrubbers in a smokestack or filters on a particular piece of machinery, which are designed to achieve the maximum emissions technology, the maximum emissions reduction that that any technology existing today is able to achieve. So we call it the best available emissions technology. And the best available technology changes over time as technology improves and new pieces of machinery that are able to reduce emissions even more become available on the market. The government will upgrade the best available technology to something new. But essentially, they're requiring you to have a certain piece of technology installed in your industrial facility. Another example of a technology standard in the Clean Air Act is the reasonable available emissions technology. This is a requirement for existing industrial facilities, not the new sources. It's difficult for existing sources of pollutants that are already constructed to upgrade to the best available technology of today. We're talking about facilities that may have been built in the 1950s, and it's just impossible to install that newest technology. So the reasonable available emissions technology says that those facilities have to install what is reasonably, and that includes economically reasonable, technology to achieve their maximum emissions reduction. But it might not be as good as the best available technology. Another example of a technology standard exists in hunting regulations. When we looked at the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation hunting regulations, we saw technology standards related to the types of weapons that you can use and firearms and things in order to go hunting. So we have seasons for bow hunting and muzzle loading. Those are different hunting technologies, and those are the only technologies that you can use during those seasons. Next, we have performance standards. These are different from technology standards, whereas technology standards, the government mandates you use a particular kind of technology. In a performance standard, the government mandates that you meet a particular threshold of performance. And so examples of that are in the National Ambient Air Quality Standards of the Clean Air Act. The government sets limits on particulate matter 2.5. Remember, these are particulates in the air 2.5 microns in diameter, and they're particularly dangerous because they lodge deep into your lung tissue, and they can even cross into the bloodstream, and they can even cross the placental barrier from a pregnant mother to an unborn child. So if you've got pollutants that are 2.5 microns and smaller, those can be particularly harmful. And the government sets standards on those, usually parts per million in the air or parts per billion for the concentration of PM 2.5. They also set performance standards for something like ground level ozone that comes out of vehicle tailpipes. And so for those performance standards, remember that they set regional attainment levels. And if the region doesn't achieve its attainment level, then they have to write a state implementation plan to explain to the federal government how they're going to work to progress towards that performance standard and meet that target in the future. Another example of a performance standard is in the Paris Agreement. Remember that the Paris Agreement, promulgated by the United Nations and all the signatory countries in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that have signed on to that agreement, have agreed to try to limit global warming temperature change to 1.5 degrees Celsius at the minimum, and to hopefully achieve a less than 2 or 2.5 degree Celsius change. So that's a performance standard because we're not mandating explicitly how countries work to achieve that goal, but on the whole, we want the planet, through this international agreement, to all behave in a way that will meet this standard. So we're trying to achieve this level of performance relative to global temperature change. And another example of a performance standard is in the Clean Power Plan. Remember, that's Barack Obama's plan to reduce carbon emissions to address climate change through Section 111D of the Clean Air Act. So the Clean Power Plan, it never became law. Obama's administration through the EPA wrote the rule, and it was then held up in court. Obama then left office, Donald Trump took over, and Donald Trump decided that he was no longer going to defend the policy in court, which essentially eliminated the policy, and so then Donald Trump is required to come up with a new policy to address carbon emissions. But the performance standard of the Clean Power Plan is to try to reduce greenhouse gases to 5% below 1990 levels, I think by 2030 is the promise there. So we want the country to try to achieve this goal, X percentage of reduction below 1990 levels by a certain time period. So we're trying to perform in a certain way. The policy itself doesn't explain how we're going to do that. It gives some guidance to the states about coal-fired power plants and methane, but essentially the policy is to achieve this goal by a certain time. Next, we have talked about some economic-based policies. These are policies that use principles of the free market, of supply and demand, taxation, so they're financially based policies that use financial incentives to get people to behave in a way that reduces their environmental footprint, or financial penalties you have to pay if your environmental footprint is over the desired threshold of the government. So what that looks like relative to supply and demand is that I've got a little graph here, right, with supply increasing across the x-axis, demand increasing on the y-axis, and also cost is increasing along the y-axis. So supply is our independent variable here. As the supply of something increases, demand for that product should decrease. As the supply increases and demand decreases, the cost also will decrease. So if we think about something like a cap-and-trade program, like the cap-and-trade program to address acid rain in the Clean Air Act. So we have permits for nitrous oxides and sulfur oxides that create that acid rain, right? Remember that those pollutants are often emitted in the Midwestern states in the United States. They blow across the country to the East Coast, where they precipitate out as acid rain over the Adirondacks and other parts of the East Coast and the Appalachians. And so what that means is that we give permits for a certain amount of pollution, but you have to pay for those permits, or the coal-fired power plants that release those pollutants have to pay for them. And we reduce the number of permits over time. So as the supply of those permits decreases, the demand for them should increase, fewer permits are available, so some of those coal-fired power plants are not going to get the permits they need, and the price of those permits is also going to increase. What that means is that those coal-fired power plants or those other factories are not going to want to pay that cost, and so they're going to convert their facilities to be to emit fewer pollutants and reduce their contribution to acid rain over time. Another example of an economic policy is the carbon fee and dividend policy. This is the policy that's being promoted by the Citizens Climate Lobby. This one places a tax on carbon that industrial facilities would have to pay, and that tax slowly increases. So as they have to pay more for the carbon that they emit, they're going to increase their pro-environmental behavior, which means that they will install new technology in the facilities to reduce their emissions of carbon dioxide or methane or whatever greenhouse gas it is that they are polluting, or we might eliminate some facilities. But as the tax increases, it's a financial penalty that encourages pro-environmental change. Remember, the carbon fee and dividend program places a fee on carbon, and as that fee accrues, the government holds onto it, and then once a year, they pay a dividend to every citizen of the United States. So we all get a little share. And we're supposed to then use that dividend to cover increasing fuel costs at the household level. So if the cost of gasoline rises, or the cost of heating fuel rises, or electricity rises as a result of the carbon fee and dividend policy, we would have the money in our pockets to help pay for that. And the last policy instrument that we will talk about is the information-based policy. These policies require folks who are industries or people who are doing something on the landscape that might have an environmental impact to list and describe those environmental impacts. So if you are complying with the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, or in New York State, the State Environmental Quality Review Act, SEQR, then you have to document all of your impacts to the environment. That includes impacts to air, water, land. It includes impacts to visual resources like viewscapes and buildings, noise pollution, groundwater pollution or soil contamination, erosion control. So you have to document all of your environmental impacts. The idea then is that once those impacts are documented, that it will help you make a decision that will reduce your environmental impact. The assumption here is that industrial facilities, corporations, private landowners don't want to harm the environment, don't want to have a big impact, but simply don't know a way to reduce their environmental impact. But by documenting the impact, it will help reveal some ways that we might reduce environmental degradation. So those are information-based policies. The policies themselves, once you document your impacts, the policies don't actually require that you take steps to reduce, avoid, or eliminate them. The assumption is that most people will do that voluntarily. The policies are simply designed to reveal hidden environmental impacts that we can't always see.